I found out I owned 22% of a company worth $11 million during a routine IRS audit, sitting across from a stone-faced auditor who seemed far more surprised by my genuine confusion than I was by the number itself. My husband had never mentioned it. Not once in 18 years of marriage. The life we built. My name is Diane, and I met my husband, Walter, when I was 26, working as an elementary school teacher in the same small city where he'd recently started a modest manufacturing company with two business partners, producing specialized components for the agricultural equipment industry. We married 2 years later, and for most of our marriage, I understood our financial arrangement in fairly simple terms. Walter ran the business, I taught school and eventually became a school administrator, and we managed our household finances together, jointly, the way I believed most long marriages did. Walter's business, Kestrel Manufacturing, grew steadily over the years, modestly at first, then more substantially after his two original partners retired, and Walter bought out their remaining shares, becoming, as far as I understood it, the company's sole owner roughly a decade into our marriage. I attended company holiday parties, knew most of his senior employees by name, and had a general, comfortable understanding of the business's trajectory without ever being deeply involved in its day-to-day operations or ownership structure. I want to be clear that this wasn't neglect or lack of interest on my part. It was simply the shape our marriage had taken, a fairly traditional division where Walter handled the business's financial and legal structure, while I handled other aspects of our shared life, an arrangement that felt, at the time, like a reasonable division of labor between two people who trusted each other. That trust is what made the audit so genuinely disorienting. The audit. The audit began, as these things often do, over something that initially seemed minor and unrelated. A discrepancy the IRS had flagged in Kestrel Manufacturing's corporate tax filings from several years earlier, triggering a broader review of the company's ownership structure and associated personal tax filings for anyone listed as a shareholder. I received a notice myself, separate from whatever correspondence Walter was receiving regarding the company's filings, requesting that I appear for an interview regarding your reported ownership interest in Kestrel Manufacturing, Inc. I remember reading that letter 3 times, genuinely confused, assuming it must be some kind of clerical error, since I had never, to my knowledge, owned any interest in Walter's company at all. I mentioned it to Walter that evening, expecting him to confirm it was simply a mistake that would be quickly resolved. Instead, I watched his face do something I'd rarely seen in 18 years of marriage, a visible, involuntary flash of something between panic and resignation, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but unmistakable. "It's probably just some paperwork mix-up," he said, a little too quickly, a little too smoothly, in a tone I recognized, uncomfortably, as the specific register he used when he was managing a conversation rather than simply having one. I should have pushed harder in that moment. I didn't, not yet, mostly because the idea that Walter might have deliberately structured something significant regarding the company without ever mentioning it to me felt, at the time, genuinely unimaginable, easier to dismiss as bureaucratic confusion than to seriously entertain. The interview. I attended the audit interview 3 weeks later, at a regional IRS office, still operating under the assumption that some administrative error would be quickly clarified and corrected. The auditor, a methodical, unemotional man named Gregory Hensley, walked me through documentation that reorganized my entire understanding of the past decade in the span of about 40 minutes. According to corporate filings dating back 11 years, I was listed as a 22% shareholder in Kestrel Manufacturing, a stake that had been formally established, according to the paperwork. During the same period, Walter had bought out his two original business partners, restructuring the company's ownership. My name appeared on the shareholder registry, on corporate tax documents listing my ownership percentage, and on a series of annual K-1 tax forms reporting my share of the company's profits and losses each year. "You've never received or filed any of these K-1 forms yourself?" Gregory asked, sliding copies across the table toward me. 11 years of documents, each one listing my name, my social security number, and a share of Kestrel's annual profits that, cumulatively, represented a genuinely substantial sum I had apparently never known existed, let alone reported on my own individual tax returns. "I've never seen any of these before in my life," I said, and I could hear my own voice sounding strange and distant, the particular vertigo of realizing a stranger across a government office desk understood more about your own financial life than you did. Gregory's expression shifted slightly, something between professional neutrality and genuine concern. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said carefully, "I need to ask you directly, were you aware, at any point over the past 11 years, that you held an ownership stake in this company?" "No," I said. "I had absolutely no idea." Understanding what had happened. Over the following weeks, working with my own attorney, a sharp, careful woman named Patricia Chen, whom I retained specifically to help me understand a situation I still barely comprehended, I began piecing together the actual shape of what had happened and why. 11 years earlier, when Walter bought out his 2 retiring business partners, he had needed to restructure Kestrel Manufacturing's ownership, and according to the documentation Patricia obtained, had worked with an accountant to distribute a portion of the company's shares in a way that provided certain tax advantages related to how the buyout was financed and how the company's profits would subsequently be distributed and taxed. Placing 22% of the company's shares in my name, it turned out, had been part of that tax strategy, a legitimate, if aggressive, structuring approach that allowed Walter to distribute some of the company's profits at my individual tax rate rather than concentrating everything at his own higher bracket, while also providing certain liability protections related to how the buyout financing had been structured. What made this legitimate tax strategy into something considerably more troubling was the fact that Walter had never told me any of it was happening. He had, according to what Patricia's investigation eventually uncovered, set up a separate address, a P.O. box, ostensibly for business correspondence, where all the shareholder documentation, K-1 forms, and associated tax paperwork bearing my name had been sent for the entire 11 years, ensuring none of it ever crossed my desk or required my direct engagement, despite the fact that I was, legally, the individual actually responsible for reporting that income. "This is where things become genuinely serious," Patricia explained to me during one of our early meetings, laying out the implications with the careful precision I came to appreciate over the following months. "You're not simply the victim of your husband keeping business details from you, uncomfortable as that is on its own. You've been the legal owner of substantial income you never reported because you never knew it existed. That creates real personal liability for you with the IRS, entirely independent of whatever marital issues this raises." Confrontation. I confronted Walter that same week, in our kitchen, with Patricia's preliminary findings spread across the table between us. 11 years of K-1 forms, corporate filings, and a paper trail leading to a P.O. box I'd never known existed, all of it establishing, unambiguously, that Walter had deliberately structured our financial life in a way that made me legally responsible for income and tax obligations I had never once been told about. "Why would you do this?" I asked, and I want to be honest that my voice in that moment carried more genuine bewilderment than anger, at least initially. The specific disorientation of trying to understand a decision that seemed to serve no clear purpose I could identify, beyond simply keeping me uninformed about something significant in our shared life. Walter was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his explanation carried a mixture of practical justification and something closer to genuine, uncomfortable honesty about his own motivations. "The accountant suggested it as a tax strategy," he said. "It made sense financially, legitimate sense, Diane. This wasn't some kind of fraud. But once it was set up, I kept thinking about how to explain it to you, and the more time passed, the more complicated it felt to bring up. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me also liked having something that was entirely mine to manage, some separate piece of the business's structure I didn't have to discuss or justify to anyone." That's not a good reason. I understand that, but it's the real one. Walter, I said slowly, I've been the legal owner of company shares worth potentially millions of dollars for over a decade, generating tax obligations I knew nothing about. And you're telling me the real reason is that you liked having something that was entirely yours to manage. Do you understand what position that's put me in? I could be facing serious tax penalties for unreported income I never even knew I had. The financial and legal reckoning. The following months involved an exhausting process of untangling 11 years of financial complexity, working simultaneously with Patricia on the marital and asset implications, and with a separate tax attorney, David Foster, specifically focused on resolving my personal exposure to the IRS regarding over a decade of unreported income tied to shares I'd never known I owned. David's assessment, once he'd reviewed the full history, was cautiously reassuring on one specific point. Because the original share distribution had been a legitimate tax strategy rather than fraudulent concealment from the IRS itself, the shares had, after all, been properly reported on Kestrel's own corporate filings, even if I personally had never seen or filed the associated individual documentation. I qualified for what's sometimes called innocent spouse relief, a provision allowing individuals in my situation to avoid personal liability for tax obligations connected to income they genuinely had no knowledge of or reasonable ability to discover on their own. That process, while ultimately successful after several months of documentation and review, was genuinely stressful, requiring me to essentially prove, to a skeptical government agency, that I had been kept in the dark about a significant financial reality in my own marriage for over a decade, a fact that felt simultaneously vindicating, in that it was, straightforwardly, true, and deeply humiliating, in that I had to formally document, for strangers, exactly how thoroughly my own husband had managed to keep something this significant from me. Once the immediate tax liability question was resolved, Patricia and I turned to the more complicated question of what my actual, legally established 22% ownership stake in Kestrel Manufacturing meant going forward. A question that, as it turned out, carried significant implications regardless of whether Walter and I remained married. You're not simply someone whose husband hid information from her, Patricia explained. You are, legally, documented as a substantial shareholder in a company worth, by conservative estimate, around $11 million. That ownership is real, established, and yours, regardless of whether you were informed of it at the time it was created. The question now isn't whether you have a claim to it, you already do, as a matter of existing legal fact. The question is how you want to exercise that ownership going forward. Deciding what to do. I sat with that reality for several weeks, working through what felt like two entirely separate but deeply intertwined questions. What I wanted for my marriage, and what I wanted to do with an ownership stake in a company I had never asked for, never managed, and had only just learned, in any real sense, that I possessed. I did not, ultimately, decide to immediately liquidate my shares or force some kind of dramatic corporate restructuring, though Patricia made clear that legally, I had standing to explore exactly that if I chose to. Instead, I made a decision that surprised even me, given everything that had happened. I decided to actually, formally step into my role as a shareholder, not as an act of anger toward Walter, but as a genuine reclamation of something that was, factually, already mine. I began attending Kestrel's quarterly shareholder meetings, something I'd never previously been invited to or even known occurred. I hired my own independent financial advisor to review the company's performance and help me understand, for the first time in 11 years, what exactly my 22% stake actually meant in practical terms. Its current value, its dividend structure, the specific rights and protections it afforded me as a legitimate owner rather than simply a name on paperwork I'd never seen. Walter, to his credit, did not fight this process once it began, though I sensed, in the early months, a certain discomfort in watching me engage directly with a part of his professional life he'd spent over a decade, keeping deliberately separate from our shared understanding of our marriage. But he also, gradually, seemed to recognize that my engagement wasn't punitive. It was simply me finally exercising ownership that had always, legally, been mine. Rebuilding trust, imperfectly. Walter and I did not divorce, though I want to be honest that this outcome wasn't obvious or guaranteed during the most difficult months of untangling everything the audit had revealed. We spent close to a year in couples counseling, working through not just the specific facts of the hidden shares, but the deeper pattern they represented. A habit I came to understand more clearly through therapy, of Walter compartmentalizing significant parts of his professional and financial life away from our marriage, keeping pieces of himself deliberately separate in ways that had, until the audit forced everything into the open. Felt to him like reasonable independence, rather than the serious breach of partnership it actually represented. I think I always believed the business was fundamentally mine to control, Walter admitted, during one particularly difficult therapy session roughly 8 months into our process. Even after we married, even after 18 years of building a life together, some part of me never fully updated that belief to reflect an actual partnership. The shares in your name were, I think, an unconscious compromise, giving you something on paper because it made financial sense, while never actually giving you the transparency and involvement that would have made it a genuine partnership rather than just documentation. That admission, painful as it was to hear, mattered to me in deciding whether rebuilding trust was possible. It represented, at minimum, a genuine attempt to understand the deeper pattern, rather than simply apologizing for the specific, discoverable fact of the hidden shares themselves. Epilogue. It has been 3 years since that IRS audit interview reorganized my understanding of my own financial life. I remain a 22% shareholder in Kestrel Manufacturing, now fully informed, fully engaged, attending every quarterly meeting, reviewing every financial statement with my own independent advisor, exercising an ownership that I insisted, once everything was resolved, would never again exist only on paper I'd never seen. Walter and I are still married, in a form considerably more transparent than what existed before the audit. We now review our combined financial picture together quarterly, a practice we instituted specifically to prevent the kind of significant, unilateral compartmentalization that had allowed 11 years of hidden ownership to exist in the first place. It isn't a perfect system, and I won't pretend the specific hurt of learning how thoroughly I'd been kept in the dark has fully disappeared, even 3 years later. But it is, genuinely, a more honest partnership than what I unknowingly lived inside for over a decade. I think often about the particular strangeness of learning something so significant about my own life from a stranger across a government office desk, rather than from the man I'd shared 18 years with. I think about how close I came to never fully understanding the shape of my own financial reality, if that IRS audit had never happened to flag Kestrel's filings for review. But I think, mostly, about what I chose to do once I finally learned the truth, not simply anger, though anger was certainly present, and not simply acceptance of whatever arrangement Walter had constructed without me, but genuine, deliberate reclamation of something that had always, factually, belonged to me. I did not ask to become a shareholder in my husband's company. But once I learned I already was one, I decided, finally, to actually be one, fully informed, fully engaged, and never again content to let my own name exist on paperwork I'd never been shown. The end,